Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm reminded of the story of someone who said he was now going to be emeritus, and someone said, well, that means that comes from the Latin. The first part, e, means out of, and meritus, you deserve to be. So if you're emeritus, you deserve to be out of here. I think this is appropriate. But I thank you for your kindness in coming along this evening, and I share your wish to have a glass of wine before too long. Thank goodness it's a beautiful evening. And I'm grateful to Simon Gillespie and the Heythrop Association for the opportunity it gives me to behave badly, and to Annabelle Clarkson, who did a lot of the organization for this. And I think we should really thank these people, because they have done a great job in doing all this. And it's very good to see my successor, Michael Holman, here. He's keeping a low profile, but I really think he should stand up, because you're going to be quite an important person in the future. And Jim Sweeney, familiar to, I think, everyone, who will be looking after the shop until January, from now until January. I'm delighted also that my first PA here is here this evening, Karen, over there. And I taught Karen, and then I recognized that she was a born PA, and I was delighted that when I started as principal, she was a great help to me, and it's wonderful. And also her husband, Francis, who was also helped us so much on the governing body. You're very welcome this evening. Now, never give a podium to a theologian and expect things to go well. I offer you, first of all, these photographs of a theologian climbing on the Forcan Ridge on a mountain called the Saddle in the Western Highlands. If only to make the point that if you want to do theology, you should make sure you have careful footwork. Don't move your foot unless you know exactly where it is going. And if you want to move, make sure you have 3 points of contact with the rock before you move the 4th point of contact. It's not a good idea to be a theologian in space. You may well judge that, given the title, that this will be a short lecture, and with good reason. We perhaps learn not very much. We forget much more, and the little that remains to us as we get older, we call wisdom. What we learn usually is a set of very simple things that give us warmth and direction when we were young, and we find our way back to that again. But if you're an adult, that will sometimes seem very far away. But as Margaret Miles points out, we never feel as grown up as we expected to feel when we were children. And Oscar Wilde makes a lovely comment that the problem with being old is not that we are old, but that we are young. Do you really feel very different now from when you were young? And what has this to do with theology? There's a question. My good friend Eamon Duffy has a very close friendship with Seamus Heaney, the poet. Eamon Duffy is in Cambridge. Seamus Heaney is in Dublin. And whenever Seamus comes to Cambridge, he stays with Eamon. And one day, they went to visit the grave of John Clare, the great peasant poet, great romantic poet, the best nature poet in English. And Seamus Heaney apparently is preoccupied with graves. He loves going to graves. And they went to see this grave near the borders of Northampton. And on the grave, on one side is John Clare, poet, and then his dates. And then on the other side, there's a little message that says, poets are born, not made. Now, this is very striking. And when Seamus Heaney was signing the visitor's book in the church afterwards, Eamon said he took out his pen. He always uses a black ink fountain pen. And he thought for a bit, and then he wrote his name, and then he wrote something else. And Eamon went to look at this. And it simply said, Seamus Heaney, poet, born and made. Are theologians born or made, or both? I think I have always been a natural theologian. As a very small child, I was a Platonist before I knew anything about Plato, because I remember as a small boy telling my parents that before I was born, I had been in heaven and had chosen them. My father laughed heartily at this, and I never forgave him. He was a natural Aristotelian, and this led to all kinds of problems in the family, and he had no truck with pre-existent souls or any of that nonsense. But one of my first pieces of advice to you is, if you want to be happy, choose your parents well. It pays off then, and it pays off all the way through your life. And I'd like to put this together with the advice that Peter Gallagher commends to the parishioners of Wimbledon. You're never too old to have a happy childhood. Now, I have no idea where this childish fantasy of mine came from. It may be a common idea among devout children to think that they were somewhere before they come to be here, to project a previous life that had substance and heavenly reality, because children cannot really imagine the world without their being part of it. How could there be reality without me in it? I suppose that's the driver behind my childish idea. I've always loved the self-absorption of children. It's a quality which is insupportable only when it lasts into adulthood, when it can become the besetting sin, particularly of clerics. And as we get older, we are to find goodness and God, not ourselves, worthy of unlimited attention. For one thing, self-absorption is a serious error of judgment. No one is that interesting. Now, it may be the case, as I imagined as a small boy, that my first entry into heaven was before I was born. But I no longer hold that idea. But heaven, I think, is not simply future. Perhaps I have been in heaven because whenever God has acted in my soul, that has been heaven. When in the Mass I have felt supported by the saints around me as a physical presence, that has been heaven. When I have seen grace work in others, that too has been heaven. And when charity has flowed through me, and when love has been fruitful in the lives of others, that has been heaven and will be heaven, because that is the life of God enfolding us now and in the time to come. The difficulty is not that we can't see what it will be like after death. The difficulty is that we know now only haltingly what is going on now. In retrospect, there was a certain inevitability that when I came to do a doctorate in theology, I did it on pre-existence language in Christology. Because Christ had been in heaven too when I was there, and we had discussed my parentage at some length, I seem to remember. These parents were very carefully chosen. Now, I don't know where you were, but clearly you weren't where the pre-existent Christ and the pre-existent John McDade was. When I had my viva at the University of Edinburgh on this doctorate, my external examiner was Rowan Williams, as brilliant then as he is now. I do think he is a theological genius and an outstanding thinker and writer. When I was speaking once, we had a discussion with Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, and in the course of this, Rowan Williams' name came up, and I said to Cormac, you know, when Rowan was elected, appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, people in the newspaper said he had the brain the size of Basingstoke. And Cormac said, and Basingstoke is a very difficult place to find your way round. I think he's a genius. I've found thinking very hard. It's a discipline I have to work at. Joseph Joubert, the French writer, wrote in 1805, once we have tasted the juice of words, the mind can no longer pass them by. We drink thought from them. Indeed so. Perhaps like a good Bordeaux, the secret is to swill the words around in our minds before we drink thoughts from them. Much better to be a theologian on a bike. And this is where I do my theological thinking, which may explain why I find theological thinking difficult. My other bike, by the way, is a racing bike. All I will tell you is that it is Italian, fast, and Ferrari red. It is too cool to be useful for theology, too exhilarating, too edgy to be a thinking place. Every academic, even the mountain biking and climbing ones, must feel accused by the comments that George Eliot makes in her novel Middlemarch about one of her characters called Casaubon, the scholar who devotes his life to finding the key to all mythologies. And he's a dreadfully arid character. And when he finally dies halfway through the novel, to everyone's great relief, the narrator, George Eliot, says this about him: "For my part, I am very sorry for him. It is an uneasy lot at best to be what we call highly taught and yet not to enjoy, to be present at this great spectacle of life and never to be liberated from a small, hungry, shivering self, never to be fully possessed by the glory we behold, never to have our consciousness rapturously transformed into the vividness of a thought, the ardor of a passion, the energy of an action, but always to be scholarly and uninspired, ambitious and timid, scrupulous and dim-sighted." Indeed so, indeed so. Too often, theology has been conducted by highly taught Casaubons in order to breed the next generation of Casaubons who don't enjoy their lives any more than their teachers did. And there is a study to be done on self-replication among theologians. But good theology has a bearing upon what is life-giving, religiously and humanly. And one of the things I've come to see is that you cannot separate what is religiously meaningful from what is humanly meaningful. A religion and a theology that keeps us at the level of a small, hungry, shivering self will eventually be cast off by people in favor of an identity outside the church. Human meaning is religious meaning. And religious meaning has to be very sure that it is at the same time human meaning. For Karl Rahner, there is only one mystery, that of the self-giving God. And this is at the same time the mystery of the God-receiving human person. Man, he says, is the event of God's self-communication. Theology is about how to think in ways that enable us to live the mystery of God. I think that's what it is. About how to think in ways that enable us to live the mystery of God. How to think in ways that enable us to do this. I've come to see that the truth of God cannot be thought. It can only be lived. And this is why it is the person and life of Jesus Christ that conveys the truth about God. Jesus does not conceptualize God. He would have made a useless modern German theologian. But he lives out a life so completely dedicated to God and those who need God that he actualizes God with us and for us. He is the performative utterance by which the divine erupts savingly within our time. Not Casaubon, the great German Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, who came to Heythrop in 1984 to be present when John Macquarie, the professor of theology in Oxford, gave a lecture in Rana's presence about Rana's theology. And while this lecture was happening, Karl Rahner sat by the side saying his rosary, presumably praying for John Macquarie. And afterwards, Rahner, through an interpreter, asked him 3 or 4 incredibly incisive questions. And Macquarie's comment was, well, I never thought I'd be given a tutorial by Karl Rahner. When a skeptical person once said to Karl Rahner, I've never had an experience of God, Rahner simply replied, I don't believe you. I just don't accept that. You have had perhaps no experience of God under this precise code word, God. But you have had, or have now, an experience of God. And I am convinced that this is true of every person. Every person? Indeed so. If you believe that God has an immediate presence in relation to his creatures. So, can you have an experience of God without knowing it to be such? Without using the code word God? Yes. It's called being a human being. And it's what you've been doing all your life. A little story to make Rahner clear. And if I say that this little story could be called Rahner for Dummies, I hope you won't be offended. It's meant to help the person next to you, not you. There are these 2 young fish swimming along. And they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, Morning, boys, how's the water? And the 2 young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and says, What the hell is water? The water is God, the liquid atmosphere of goodness and gift in which we live and breathe and swim. And becoming an old fish, a mature theologian, means getting to know the water as water and God as God in whom we are. I like the story about the little girl who hears music for the first time and cries out, It's God speaking to us. Tells you a lot about music, I think. For some months, I've taken delight in the words of Vincent van Gogh, who said, The best way to know God is to love many things. Why don't commentators bring out the deeply religious nature of Van Gogh's artistic work? Is it possible that Van Gogh in his paintings was learning to know and love God? This is one of the wonderful paintings by Van Gogh. If this was properly darkened, you would see a man and a woman down here coming in this direction. It's a nighttime scene on the Rhone, the river with the stars there. That God is not seen in the painting is important because God is not an object within the world, not a fact alongside other facts. Many of our new atheists seem to be rejecting a view of God as a thing in the world alongside other things, one cause among other secondary causes. But the theological principle is surely the simple one, that God does not wish to be everything. To say that God created the world for his glory is to say that he created it not for his sake, but for ours. That is why in the world there are people as different as Annabelle Clarkson and Lady Gaga. You know my admiration for you is boundless, Annabelle. Whereas my views about Lady Gaga are not for public consumption. One must be charitable. And there is the Rhone, and the stars, and the boats, and the man and the woman in the foreground of the painting with their back to the nighttime theophany, looking at us, perhaps on their way home, back to bed, seemingly unaware of the divine glory that the painter sees, like the two young fish swimming along, unaware that they are in water. By moving towards what is true and good and valuable, through the powers or virtues that take shape in personhood, you latch on to God. And when you latch on to God, you're in the only place you can be. If God is reality, what Aquinas calls ipsum esse, being itself, simply the real, then being in God is the only place where we can be. And outside that reality, we simply stop. I no longer believe in hell. If someone does not latch on to goodness, truth, generous and sacrificial loving, a defining care for the world and its creatures, and refuses all these things in an unimaginably definitive way, then in their death, they simply stop. They don't go anywhere because there is no self that can go or be at all. If you empty the self of goodness, you empty the self of the capacity to be. Goodness is existence. If you step completely outside goodness, you cannot be. The other side of this is that in every aspect of your personhood, your ordinary living and loving, God is loving you into wholeness, and when that process is complete, it is what we theologians call resurrection. You will know the story about Lord Mackay of Clashfern, who was in the government, I think the Conservative government. He was Lord Chief Justice, I think. He used to tell the story, he was a very serious Presbyterian. He used to tell the story of a devout Presbyterian in Scotland being accused in the court of a very serious offence, and the case against him is brought. And then the judge says, "Will the defence like to bring forward its witnesses?" And the accused stands up and says, "I need no witnesses, because God alone is my witness that I am innocent." And the judge said, "Well, that may be so, but my advice to you is to call someone better known locally." Try to make God better known locally. If you're wondering what purgatory is all about, and we're going through the great mysteries tonight, with rod and line, as they say, I refer you to my article, Judgment on Purgatory, on my webpage, where you will find also hours of fun reading all kinds of other stuff. But I should tell you about Thérèse of Lisieux and purgatory. I have a particular devotion to the little flower because when I was a small child, I was healed of glandular trouble in my neck by her relics, carried by Canon Taylor at a centre near Glasgow called Carfin. This was, Carfin was like a mini Scottish Lourdes. It was a replica of the real Lourdes, but it had the same power. And every time over my 12 years as principal, I needed something done in the college and didn't know what to do or how to go about it, I would go up to the Carmelite church up in Kensington Church Street and I would light a candle to the little flower. And when the Quality Assurance Agency inspectors came to Heythrop for the first time, They didn't realize that the room they were in had various pictures of the little flower concealed in cupboards, under carpets, stuck under tables. And our prayers were always answered. The Heythrop staff think that they got through these audits through their own efforts, and let them continue to think so. But the truth is elsewhere. Remember that I had been in heaven before I was born, and things were negotiated and sorted out there a long time ago. But the little flower, on her deathbed, the nuns in the Carmelite convent are clucking round her bedside because one of them says, Therese will go straight to heaven because she's such a saint, whereas the rest of us, we're destined for a long time in purgatory. And Therese, very weak, lifts her head up from the pillow and she says to them, there is no purgatory for those who love. And she put her head back down in the pillow and then engaged in the difficult process of handing herself over to a God of whose presence she was not sure. But Thérèse of Lisieux is a doctor of the church now. And her family name is Thérèse Martin. So in the parishes of the East End, she's known as Doc Martin. Now, you will probably be surprised by some words I used a few minutes ago. I spoke about latching on to God. Now, I guarantee you have never heard that phrase in any theology lecture in this college, until now. What is my authority for it? Well, no less a person than Pope Benedict. I had a conversation a few years ago with the Muslim scholar in Cambridge, Tim Winter, who is a convert to Islam, and he said to me, you know, I like Pope Benedict. Now, I was quite surprised at this because people don't usually say that kind of thing to me. You know, I like Pope Benedict, so I said, what do you like about Pope Benedict? And he said, well, he knows what religion is about. I said, what? He said, well, he knows that religion is not about social cohesion. Religion is about truth, and Benedict knows that. I thought, that's good. Now, I want to look at a speech which Pope Benedict made when he visited the Czech Republic. I find this an extremely important and interesting little text. Let's read it. I'm going to take it paragraph by paragraph and comment as we go through it. Here, I think naturally of the words which Jesus quoted from the prophet Isaiah, namely that the temple must be a house of prayer for all the nations. Jesus was thinking of the so-called court of the Gentiles, which he cleared of extraneous affairs so that it could be a free space for the Gentiles who wished to pray there to the one God, even if they could not take part in the mystery for whose service the inner part of the temple was reserved. Now, notice, Benedict is acknowledging that there can be a differentiated closeness to God in different degrees. Not a separation of some from God, but a differentiation of degrees of closeness. But they are all modes of proximity and contact. Notice that Benedict says that Jesus wanted to create there a free space for the Gentiles to contact God in ways not identical with Israel's worship, but related to it. So the expectation is not that these Gentiles will become Jews and therefore Jewish participants in the cult, but they will have their own space in which, in ways proper to them, within God's dispensation, they will be dealt with by God. Next paragraph. A place of prayer for all the peoples. By this, he was thinking of people who know God, so to speak, only from afar, who are dissatisfied with their own gods, rites, and myths, who desire the pure and the great, even if God remains for them the unknown God. They had to pray to the unknown God, yet in this way they were somehow in touch with the true God, albeit amid all kinds of obscurity. Now, little comment. Notice how Benedict speaks very respectfully of those who know God from afar, who are detached from the myths and assumptions of their own culture because they're not nourishing, but experience a movement within them directed towards a goodness that they do not know, but which they desire in some measure. It's a movement towards God, although God is and remains unknown. And that's what's so interesting about it. There can be then a significant movement towards the unknown God that takes a non-religious form. Let me go over that sentence again because it's very important. Religious people need to learn this. There can be a significant movement towards the unknown God that takes a non-religious form. Why should we assume that only religious forms are how people connect to God and latch onto him? Benedict's assumption is that there are important movements towards God from within agnosticism. And this is caused and supported by the God who draws all men and women to himself in ways that they do not express in formally religious ways. Next paragraph. Now this is where it gets really interesting, and I'd like to see this happen. I think that today, too, the church should open up a sort of court of the Gentiles in which people might in some way latch on to God without knowing him and before gaining access to his mystery, at whose service the inner life of the church stands. Today, in addition to interreligious dialogue, there should be a dialogue with those to whom religion is something foreign, to whom God is unknown, and who nevertheless do not want to be left merely godless, or as I might say, goodless, but rather to draw near to him, albeit as the unknown. Now, I find this very interesting. I'm told that when Michael Barnes does an imitation of me, he has me say, it's very interesting. But it is, this one is. What Benedict proposes is the creation of a place of serious conversation in which the church talks and listens with unbelievers, Gentiles, those who stand in the covenant that God made with all human beings and all living things through Noah. If you go to Catholic Mass, whenever the word Gentile is translated in the Jerusalem Bible, it translates it as pagans. And it is deeply offensive to describe people as pagans. Gentiles are those who stand in the covenant that God made with Noah. Chapter 9 of the book of Genesis. They are those who are imperfectly covenanted, but they are covenanted. And it makes a difference how you regard those who are outside the particular religious tradition that we're in. The Catholic tradition seems to me to be strongly positive in affirming God's presence at work in everyone. So, no one is outside the covenant. That is important in Benedict's statement, and agnostics and unbelievers have a connection with what Christians hold and believe. They are simply in a courtyard within walking distance from where we are. And that architectural image is very important. You can pass from one courtyard to the other because they're adjacent. You don't need me to remind you that Thomas Aquinas held that we are joined to God as to one who is, as it were, unknown. Quasi ignotum, says Aquinas. And ignotum is like the Latin equivalent of agnostic. So there are circles of closeness and ignorance around the sacred presence which partly overlap with one another, and it's a deep mistake to treat non-believers as outside God's action. You do believe, don't you, in a doctrine of creation in which God is directly active in the lives of all. And it's a mistake to think that they stand in a completely different space from us. There is a continuity among all human beings in relation to God. Now, one of Jack Mahony's great stories is the story about the Presbyterian Church, again, a Scottish story, where there's a guest preacher, and he preaches a wonderful sermon on repentance, and the congregation has a great time because they're all sinners, and they suddenly realize how terrible their sinfulness is, but how wonderful is the grace and the mercy of God. And the tears are flowing all through the congregation, except for one man who sits there like this. One of the officials notices this, and when the service is over, goes up to him and says, "Now, hope you don't mind my asking, but everyone was moved by that sermon, apart from you, apparently, and I just wonder why you weren't touched by that powerful sermon." And the man said, "Well, it's very simple. I'm not from this parish." Well, if Benedict told jokes as part of his theology, he would tell this one, but I'm afraid he's German, and Germans don't do jokes. Where would we be without a sense of humor, Willie Rushton used to ask. Germany. Well, a doctrine of creation means that everyone is in the parish. Part of our trouble theologically is that we don't take this doctrine seriously and invest too much energy on questions of salvation. I'd like to see a form of Christianity that promoted the primacy of a doctrine of creation, which I really think is the fundamental doctrine in Christian theology, rather than the salvation-centered style of religion and theology that's been dominant since the Reformation. You know that in Scotland we say that John Knox was the man who put the smile into Calvinism. I suspect that creation is the doctrine that we need in order to commend the gospel in this culture. I come more and more to think that the mode in which Christians communicate with others best is through conversation, dialogue, witness, and a sense of shared inquiry among adults. If there is one thing I want for the church, is to foster a culture of study and shared inquiry as a way of conducting our mission. The strength of the Catholic tradition is the way in which religious truth is articulated philosophically. And Augustine was quite clear that there wasn't one thing called religion and another thing called philosophy. For him, religion was philosophy. And the church has become preoccupied with a strangely monological form of teaching in which things are said and it's not quite clear whether anyone is listening. And if you spend all your time talking, you never hear the person you're speaking with, and you never learn the things you need to learn from those who are different. And if we're not mature in our self-criticism and self-evaluation, in reshaping our identity as an adult church, then why should anyone take us seriously? Religions get lost, as people do, Franz Kafka remarked. And I think that each religion has its own way of getting lost. Jews do it in their way, or maybe they do it in multiple ways. And Muslims, I think, are also asking a question like that. It's important for Christians to ask, what is the way in which Christianity might get lost? I suspect we haven't really begun to explore that question, but we need to. And I think that Benedict's words in these paragraphs seem to me to have radical consequences for how we construe the church and its mission. Cardinal Martini the Jesuit cardinal in Milan some years ago, who was tipped, I think, to become the successor, to become the present position that Pope Benedict has. The joke in Rome was that Martini's problem was how to stop Martini Rosso becoming Martini Bianco. But Martini, when he was cardinal in Milan, used to organize discussions on Sunday evenings with unbelievers in his cathedral. It's a famous discussion he has with Umberto Eco on the theme of hope. Okay? You begin with an issue that's fundamental to human beings. There's the interesting book by Rowan Williams, which is trying to present the idea of Christianity. He spends most of it discussing trust. What does trust mean? Why is trust important for human life and human relationships and human purpose? And in this way, in a culture that is becoming increasingly deaf to the word God, the word God simply resonates in no way in people's lives anymore. You have to begin with categories that are grounded in unspoken aspects of the self to enable people to feel the questions again in their bones. Now, I want to suggest to you, not too long to go, the wine is coming, that the church in the years ahead will be taken through an experience, a very difficult experience, analogous to the experience of the Jewish community through 2,000 years of Christian Europe. In other words, marginal to the main currents of cultural development, called to bear witness while having no power, needing to address the question of how to define and maintain an identity which will allow a distinctive voice of benefit to others to be heard. In many ways, an underground culture whose central energies, although marginalized, will come to enrich everyone. What Jews have been in the Europe of the past, we Christians will be in the future. And we better be ready for that. And what Jews and Christians might do together, with Muslims too, I hope, is to keep the space for God open in a society which, because of the demands of capitalist pressures, makes people subject to manipulation, lies, and degradation of the soul. We have to keep the way open to nothing less than the good, to nothing less than ultimate meaning, to nothing less than the full dignity of persons, to nothing less than the divine mystery itself that can encompass and transform brutality and malice. That is what many Jews today call tikkun olam, healing the world. And it's a religious vision in which Christians can share with the distinctive energies and spiritual experiences of the Christian faith. I've always loved Pope John Paul II's description of the Christian mission, that we are to be a blessing to the world. And if Jews and Christians are to be a blessing to the world, we must first be a blessing to one another. A shared witness to God's transcendence and love, to religious values, which alone can promote authentically human values, to mutual enrichment of our common vocation to serve and bear witness to God and to look for the coming of the Messiah in glory and the life of the age to come. My task as a Christian is to act always in ways that are good for Jews and strengthen them in their mission from God. And Rabbi Jonathan Gorski on the staff seems to me to be doing this reciprocally in a remarkable way, always acting in ways that bring blessings on the Christians and Muslims he teaches. I've been deeply affected over the last few years, spiritually in my soul, by the writings of the Jewish philosopher Immanuel Levinas. And I quote a little summary of his teaching in which an American academic, Adrian Pepperzak, says this: the good itself can be neither chosen nor contemplated, but can be loved only by accepting the responsibility for goodness in the world. I'll go over that again. The good itself can be neither chosen nor contemplated, but can be loved only by accepting the responsibility for goodness in the world. If the good is God, then we do not go directly towards God, but always love God through our accepting responsibility for goodness and justice and the afflicted in the world. That seems to me to be the true religion that brings out the best in us. It's why I think a religious identity is the only satisfactory way of being human. A commitment to the unrestricted good of humanity is how we access and are shaped by the goodness that is God himself. And this, I suspect, is the only proper response to the kind of atheism that dismisses religion as delusion. The great Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe used to say, if you don't love, you'll die. And if you do love, you'll be crucified. Make your choice. A great man with a holy mind. I share Karl Rahner's concern that our present form of the Christian religion might not be adequate for our mission and might actually be contributing to the marginalization of Christianity, consigning God to the status of the ancient gods of Greece and Rome, mythological figures, but irrelevant to the human project. What is needed in the church is a culture of study and inquiry, open and respectful, a model of how human beings might work together towards the goal of a shared, lasting human good. And I find it very strange that as the culture in which we're in is finding it more and more difficult to relate to Jesus Christ and his gospel, we're concerned with whether girls can serve at Tridentine liturgies. I'm afraid if you won't let them exercise a simple lay ministry, don't baptize them in the first place. In my final report to the governors last week, I said, and this is a quotation on your sheet, the distinctive role of Heythrop, bridging philosophy and theology, holding together on the one hand the Jesuit educational tradition, and on the other, the identity of a college set up by Royal Charter within the University of London, refusing to set in opposition the demands of Catholic identity and ecumenical diversity, deliberately setting for itself an intellectual engagement with the issues in critical modernity, taking seriously a Catholic Christian philosophical theological tradition, and at the same time offering hospitality and dialogue with other religious traditions. If you wanted such a place, you could not simply whisk it out of the air. But it is the kind of college we already have and are already building, and it's worth fostering. I know that governors will not allow it to become something less worthy than what it is already. In many ways, Heythrop is already a court of the Gentiles, with pathways between Christians and non-religious people, between Christians and Jews and Muslims, between the monotheistic faiths and the Asian religions, with a lively group of research centers covering philosophy of religion, religious life, Eastern Christianity, interreligious dialogue, the Heythrop Institute. We conduct our life with a graced sense of working together on something important, in many ways echoing the words of John Henry Newman when he said, "Truth is wrought out by many minds working together freely. This has ever been the rule of the church until now. The church is not a citadel, but a school of truth in thought and action. You can belong to it only by being a learner, by adopting the yoke of truth-bearing with integrity. Truth is wrought out by many minds, says Newman. And the key words are many minds and freely, because you cannot study and engage in inquiry without pluralism, difference, and liberty. Newman knew that point in the extremely repressive church of Pius IX. We forget it still at our peril. Theology, sacra doctrina, like truth itself, is a self-correcting and self-implicating discipline, and it flourishes only in a church that values truth above pragmatism. Religious truth is not established by decree, but is reached through dialogue, inquiry, shared study, a body of scholars working together in a context of inquiry into the truth that the church needs for its mission. That is the ideal of theological study within a properly functioning Catholic Church that Newman presents. And a passable version of this, I say only a passable version of this, has been developing at Heythrop. All I have done, I think, as principal, is to enable something valuable to take shape here that might be of service to Christ's church and God's world. Finally, I want to read a poem with you, so that the last words you hear this evening will be not mine, but those of a great Polish poet, Czesław Miłosz. I remember being on the Underground one day with Robert Murray, and if I pay tribute to Robert Murray, I think he's simply one of the great theological geniuses of the Jesuit province and of this college. And we were passing through the tube, and on a platform there was a wonderful photograph of an Amerindian chief. I think it was connected with the Museum of Mankind, to do with cultures and different things. And this wonderful figure with a wonderful headpiece was there. And Robert Murray looked at him and said, "I bet he's in touch." Now, he didn't tell me what this person was in touch with, but I think that he meant that he was in touch with the real, with God. And Miłosz, in this poem, I think, is in touch. It fits me very well at this stage in my life, and you may well judge that it fits you too well as we end the boring part of this evening and become party-goers. But let us read the poem. Late Ripeness. Not soon, as late as the approach of my 90th year, I felt a door opening in me, and I entered the clarity of early morning. One after another, my former lives were departing, like ships, together with their sorrow. And the countries, cities, gardens, the bays of seas assigned to my brush came closer, ready now to be described better than they were before. I was not separated from people. Grief and pity joined us. We forget, I kept saying, that we are all children of the King. For where we come from, there is no division into yes and no, into is, was, and will be. We were miserable. We used not more than 100th part of the gift we received for our long journey. Moments from yesterday and from centuries ago, a sword blow, the painting of eyelashes before a mirror of polished metal, a lethal musket shot, a caravel staving its hull against a reef. They dwell in us, waiting for a fulfillment. I knew always that I would be a worker in the vineyard, as are all men and women living at the same time, whether they are aware of it or not. Thank you very much.
Perhaps fun.
Fun, yes, fun. Fun.
Enjoy your
Fun.
time.
I'd like fun.
Future.
Yes.
So on behalf of all of us,
Thank you.
very,
Fun.
very
Thank you very
grateful.
much. Thank you very much. Oh. Do I get a kiss? Thank you. Thank you very much. I should throw it into the crowd.